Thanks for joining us for our fourth and final webinar with Professor Carter Snead on what it means to be human. This webinar series is hosted by the University of Michigan Medical School Program on Health, Spirituality, and Religion and the Burr Oak Foundation. Tonight, our topic is end of life and human flourishing. So here's the roadmap for our time together tonight. We will start with a few minutes of opening remarks by the president of the Burr Oak Foundation, Dr. Joe Bufiel, and he will help set the stage for our discussion tonight. Following Dr. Bufiel's remarks, we will have about 40 minutes of remarks by Professor Snead on end of life. And with that, I will turn over the microphone to Dr. Bufiel for his opening remarks. Joe?
There, I'm unmuted. Thanks, Kristen. Just wanted to give a little context to the topic this evening, which is end of life. Death is one of two things. Either it is annihilation, and the dead have only a dreamless sleep, or, as we are told, it is really a change, a transfer of the soul from this place to some other. But which it is, God alone knows. These words are from the philosopher Plato, written 2,500 years ago, and they're always relevant. The ancients realized that the consideration of our mortality, reminding ourselves often that we will die, is the beginning of wisdom. Death is what helps us to focus on what matters, to work toward answering the question posed by our life. What do we live for? Is there a meaning and purpose to our existence? How should we relate to the persons and things around us? How are we to live a good life? Even though hardly a day passes without new descriptions of killing and dying, both fictional and factual, invading our consciences, many of us still choose to remain inattentive. The practical neglect of our impending death is especially apparent today, perhaps because of the astounding scientific advances of the past 100 years have distracted us. Some are beginning to believe that death can be overcome with technology. Many others, especially those of us enjoying the comforts of affluent Western societies, are distracted by our material prosperity. According to a number of contemporary scholars, these distractions that make it so easy to blow off the pressing questions raised by our mortality are the root cause of most of our modern frictions. The American cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker has been a particularly effective advocate of this proposition. In his 1973 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, he identified death, understood as annihilation, as the worm at the core of the human psyche. According to Becker, the tension generated by our instinct for self-preservation on the one hand, and the inevitability of our death on the other, cause a profound crisis. If this crisis is not addressed and the thought of death is repressed, a corrosive death anxiety results. This death anxiety leads some people to a paralyzing terror and leads the rest of us to search for strategies to cope. Humans stressed out about their mortality construct social systems, cultures, whose purpose it is to facilitate our denial of death. Becker called these immortality projects, and they are a way of striving for the heroic, taking part in activities which lead us to believe that we are something more than our physical bodies, someone who won't just disappear. Becker writes, We achieve ersatz immortality by sacrificing ourselves to conquer an empire, to build a temple, to write a book, to establish a family, to accumulate a fortune, to further progress and prosperity, to create an information society and a global free market. Since the main task of human life is to become heroic and transcend death, every culture must provide its members with an intricate symbolic system that is covertly religious. This means that ideological conflicts between cultures are essentially battles between immortality projects, holy wars. So for Becker, immortality, which he understood as the desire for a perfect world, is what compels humans to do most of the evil we do, not only to each other, but to the earth. We are now 50 years out from the publication of his work, and it is undeniable that many contemporary scholars have built influential careers on developing Becker's premise that the basic motivation for human behavior is the need to control the terror that results from discovering that one day we will cease to be. The distinguished Stanford University psychiatrist Irvin Yalom, also a professed atheist, understood death as existential obliteration and identified it as one of the 4 key challenges that haunt the daily lives of human beings, the others being isolation or loneliness, the experience of the absence of an external structure, and a world of uncertain meaning. 3 American social psychologists, Tom Pyshinsky, Sheldon Solomon, and Jeff Greenberg, began a movement to provide experimental data in support of Becker's insights. Hundreds of studies and thousands of papers have been published since 1986, when they developed their terror management theory, which postulates that deep down, a repressed awareness of death and fear of annihilation are the root cause of most social conflicts. They propose that religion is simply a way of adopting a cultural worldview that aspires to achieve symbolic immortality. Cultures, which are usually founded on religious claims, collectivize individual fear and loneliness into a communal exercise. The fear of existential obliteration leads us to invent God and a hereafter as a way of coping with our inevitable disappearance. Ernest Becker began his academic career as a professed atheist, but he was no mortal enemy of religion. Like Plato, he suggested that reason and science can't give us the answers we seek when confronting death. He concluded the denial of death by stating, "There is a driving force behind a mystery that we cannot understand, and it includes more than reason alone. The urge to cosmic heroism, then, is sacred and mysterious, and not to be neatly ordered and rationalized by science and secularism." And in another work, The Spectrum of Loneliness, he wrote, "One's existence is a question which must be answered, and the answer can never come from one's self. A life can only be validated by some kind of beyond which explains it and in which it is immersed." So the answer that Becker points to is ultimately theological. In fact, Becker's life ended at the age of 49 in a hopeful affirmation that, quote, beyond this world of accident and contingency and terror and death, there is a meaning that redeems. In a deathbed interview he gave to Sam Keene for the journal Psychology Today, Becker explicitly professed his belief in God. And let's hear what he had to say. I am out of a Jewish tradition, but I was an atheist for many years. I think the birth of my first child, more than anything else, was the miracle that woke me up to the idea of God, seeing something pop in from the void and seeing how magnificent it was, unexpected, and how much beyond our powers and our ken. But I don't feel more religious because I'm dying. I would want to insist that my awakening to the divine had to do with the loss of character armor. For the child, the process of growing up involves a masking over of fears and anxieties by the creation of character armor. Since the child feels powerless and very vulnerable, he has to reinforce his power by plugging into another source of power. I look at it in electrical circuit terms. Father, mother, or the cultural ideology becomes his unconscious power source. We all live by delegated powers, and we are utterly dependent on other people. In personality breakdown, what is revealed to the person is that he is not his own person. So it seems that for Becker, and hopefully for all of us, suffering and dying may involve a certain illumination. As we experience an illness or as we die, we are able to do less, to move less, and at times even to think less. And as our physical horizons contract, these experiences offer us an opportunity to embark on an interior journey of self-discovery, an opportunity to acknowledge our lifelong radical vulnerability and utter dependency on others. And that's not a bad thing. It's just the way it is. By embracing the fact that we do not belong to ourselves, that we are not our own person, we can appreciate that responsibility for our dignity in life and in death ought to belong to others because we all need one another. Our laws and policies should make belonging to one another easier. And this is basically the point of Professor Snead's book. Autonomy and expressive individualism are deficient foundations for laws governing medicine, or any law for that matter, because in fact, we are not self-sufficient entities, and always getting what we want is not necessarily a recipe for human flourishing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe. Carter, thanks for joining us again tonight. The floor is yours.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you both so much again for the opportunity to speak with your wonderful online community here, the folks at the University of Michigan and others who are tuning in also. My talk this evening, and my final talk, is about end-of-life decision-making, not just decisions involving the termination or declining of life-sustaining measures, but also the law and policy and ethical disputes over assisted suicide. So since I'm taking on both topics, I think it's worth taking on both topics because they are connected to each other in important ways. So my prepared remarks this evening are a little bit longer than the previous lectures, but not too much longer. So to this point, the inductive anthropological analysis of my prior lectures has focused on the public bioethics concerning the beginning of life, specifically the domains of abortion and assisted reproduction. The vision of human identity and flourishing that emerged after drilling into the law's normative foundations to surface the goods it means to serve and the harms it aims to prevent or remediate was that of expressive individualism. Now the inquiry shifts to life's other margin, namely the public bioethics of death and dying. And while there are myriad points of entry into this area of the law, including the definition of death, organ donation, medical futility, this analysis will focus on, as I said moments ago, the fundamental public questions of perennial and crucial import to the law of end-of-life decision-making, refusal or discontinuation of life-sustaining measures, and assisted suicide. And I'll follow the same inductive approach as before. I'll show that in both of these areas of the law, the same vision of the person obtains as in the public bioethics of abortion and assisted reproduction, namely that of a lonely, atomized will seeking to freely chart its destiny according to the authentic truths discovered within. Just as at the beginning of life, a public bioethics based on this impoverished conception of human identity and flourishing is unable to respond fully to the neediness and vulnerability of finite, dependent, embodied beings at the end of life. Accordingly, in this context, as before, there's a need for an anthropological augmentation to the law's foundations to make it more humane, just, and fully human. In the United States, the law governing the decision to decline or discontinue unwanted medical care, including life-sustaining measures, is generally set forth by the statutes and judicial decisions of the individual states. It is rooted in the common law of battery, which forbids unwanted touchings. Upon this foundation, the law of informed consent was erected as an additional protection for bodily integrity, specifically in the context of medical care. As the Supreme Court observed in Cruzan versus Director, Missouri Department of Health, quote, the logical corollary of the doctrine of informed consent is that the patient generally possesses the right not to consent, that is, to refuse treatment. Whether grounded in the constitutional liberty interest or in the common law of informed consent, in every jurisdiction in the United States, it is lawful for a competent patient to decline or discontinue unwanted medical care, including life-sustaining measures. The principal normative justification is to protect the patient autonomy and self-determination for those patients who are of sound mind. This legal framework is not controversial, generally speaking, as applied to such individuals, namely individuals of sound mind. However, and those who can participate in their own medical decision-making owing to their own competency. Difficulties arise, however, when these legal principles are applied to patients who are not capable of making decisions for themselves. Jurisdictions throughout the United States, courts and state legislatures have embraced the notion that the right to decline life-sustaining measures can be exercised on behalf of patients who no longer have the capacity to decide for themselves. While the details of the laws vary somewhat, the common thread is that the patient's actual prior wishes, if discernible, are paramount. If there is a decisive past written or oral evidence that expresses the patient's preferences for the circumstances at issue, then they are generally to be implemented. Courts also allow for proxy decision makers under the auspices of a substituted judgment standard to make a decision about what the patient would have wanted based on his expressed wishes, values, and opinions, and any other evidence indicating what treatment he would choose or decline under the circumstances. Because the goal is to vindicate the patient's autonomy and self-determination, this is meant to be a purely subjective inquiry. If it proves impossible to determine what the patient's actual wishes were prior to losing the capacity to decide for himself, some jurisdictions allow for treatment decisions to be made according to a best interest standard. Unlike the substituted judgment approach, which is meant to be subjective and entirely tailored to the patient's preferences, the best interest standard is meant to be objective, implementing what a reasonable person would choose under the circumstances. If there is any probative evidence of the patient's preferences, that is incorporated also into the analysis. If not, the decision is made by weighing benefits and burdens under a reasonableness standard. For example, in the absence of any evidence of the patient's wishes, the New Jersey Supreme Court, in a case called In re Conroy, proposed a pure objective standard under which life-sustaining measures should be terminated when it is demonstrated that, quote, the net burdens of the patient's life with treatment clearly and markedly outweigh the benefits that the patient derives from life, and the patient is subjected to recurring, unavoidable, and severe pain, rendering the continuation of life-sustaining measures inhumane. That's the objective framework provided by the New Jersey court in Conroy, which it's pretty well representative of best interest approach across the country. Now, in actual clinical practice, nearly all decisions regarding life-sustaining measures are made by families in private deliberation and are never subject to litigation and the publicity that comes with it. It's only in the rare instance where the family members or caregivers disagree so strongly that they seek a resolution to the courts and the court of public opinion. Nevertheless, worries about such disputes over life-sustaining measures have motivated a widespread public campaign to encourage people to memorialize their treatment preferences in legal instruments to be used to govern their medical care in the event of their future incompetence. Now, every state has laws providing for the creation of some form of advance directive meant to guide life-sustaining treatment decisions after the individual loses the capacity to do so, and likewise excuse healthcare providers who follow such directives from legal liability. In 1990, Congress passed the Patient Self-Determination Act, requiring healthcare facilities that receive Medicare or Medicaid funds to give patients under their care information about advance directives under state law. If such patients have an advance directive, this must be noted in their medical records. Now, advance directives can take a variety of forms. Instruction directives are written or oral declarations about future treatment preferences, including end-of-life decision-making. A proxy directive, often called a healthcare power of attorney, designates a person who can make medical decisions in the event that the patient becomes incapacitated. Living wills are written instruments that seek to provide instructions for medical care, including termination of life-sustaining measures when the patient can no longer decide for himself. According to the President's Council on Bioethics, the idea of the living will has been enthusiastically endorsed not only by Congress and the courts, but also by state legislatures, the Veterans Administration, medical and legal associations, doctors, lawyers, ethicists, and patient advocacy organizations. Just as for the law of abortion and assisted reproduction, the anthropology of the law of life-sustaining measures emerges from first considering the goods that it's meant to advance. The primary good that decisively orients the legal framework here is autonomy. It single-mindedly seeks to advance the good of being free from unwanted bodily intrusion. Some state courts, referring specifically to abortion jurisprudence, style it as the good of privacy. Others have described it as the right to the possession and control of one's person, or the right to be left alone. The form of autonomy conferred on patients by the law of end-of-life decision-making is the freedom to shape their life's narrative, to construct a conclusion that reflects their own self-understanding, and to convey this meaning to others by the choices that they make. Legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin wrote that people, quote, want their deaths, if possible, to express and in that way vividly confirm the values they believe most important to their lives. Thus, the image of the flourishing person that lies beneath the legal mechanisms of this domain is the solitary individual seeking to assert his will in the face of mortality and suffering, to make a final existential choice that will express his deeply held views about the meaning and value of his life and how to live it. This is the protagonist of expressive individualism, authoring the last chapter of his self-constructed story. As applied to a patient of sound mind, competent to make his or her own treatment decisions, this is a mostly uncontroversial anthropological grounding for the law. To be sure, it fails to account for the diminished agency that comes with suffering, the more complex array of preferences and desires of patients in this context, and the web of other people affected by such decisions. But given the intimate, delicate, and highly personal nature of these choices, there are good prudential reasons to keep the intrusive machinery of the state from interfering too much with the decision-making by competent patients regarding their own care. Concerns about fraud, abuse, and duress are less grave when a patient can reflect, deliberate, and decline unwanted care in his or her own voice. Forcing medical care on competent patients against their wishes runs contrary to the well-settled and widely shared principles of American law and medical ethics. However, the anthropology of expressive individualism becomes highly problematic when illness or injury has silenced the patient or otherwise rendered her incompetent to make decisions regarding life-sustaining measures. The person as an atomized, unencumbered will seeking its own path forward does not match the lived embodied reality of profound vulnerability and dependence, of debilitating injury and illness that leaves one unable to reflect and make life and death choices. And yet, expressive individualism remains the anthropology of the law in these circumstances. The law insists on the fiction that it's possible to exercise autonomy and self-determination once the ability to formulate or express a decision regarding end-of-life sustaining measures is irretrievably lost. It falsely equates the current exercise of autonomy with binding a now incapacitated patient to previously expressed wishes either by operation of a living will or by reconstructing his intentions by recalling less solemn forms of communication. To borrow the words of the President's Council on Bioethics, the law's mechanisms at the end of life decision-making for incompetent patients rest on the anthropological premise that, quote, each individual can remain by this remote control a self-determining agent, even when he can no longer directly or contemporaneously determine his own fate. The shortcomings of a legal strategy rooted in autonomy and self-determination for profoundly vulnerable, dependent, and cognitively impaired patients dependent upon life-sustaining measures becomes clear in light of the frustrated aspirations of the nationwide campaign for the living will. Putting aside the fact that only about a quarter of people in the United States have living wills, there's good reason to believe that even for those who do, it's not as effective as the sole means to govern end-of-life decision-making once competence is lost. The President's Council on Bioethics, reviewing the social science evidence analyzed by Amy Fagerlin and the University of Michigan's Carl Schneider, found that many people surveyed preferred to let proxy decision makers have leeway to make choices on their behalf. Vulnerable people facing the possibility of life's end do not seek to assert their unencumbered wills. They want help from those who love them or from experts committed to caring for them. Moreover, most people find it difficult to accurately predict their preferences for an unspecifiable future confronted with unidentifiable maladies with unpredictable treatments. A meta-analysis of multiple studies showed that large percentages of people routinely change their preferences regarding life-sustaining measures in a relatively short period of time. The difficulty for strategies of legal pre-commitment becomes especially acute when the young and healthy try to imagine how and whether they would find meaning in a much diminished state due to disease, injury, or senescence. The President's Council noted that there is an extensive body of research on how poor we are at predicting our own preferences and desires, especially in regard to choices far off in the future. Moreover, living wills as drafted are often either under-inclusive regarding possible future scenarios or are so overbroad that they do not provide sufficiently concrete guidance. Schneider and Fagerlin do not blame this problem on poor drafting, but rather the nature of the task itself, namely, trying to predict a highly complex and variable future. Even more problematic is that studies have shown that patients themselves are ambivalent about whether their instructions should be precisely followed. Some studies have indicated that living wills do not meaningfully improve the accuracy of proxy decision makers in predicting the actual preferences of patients. According to the President's Council on Bioethics, quote, strikingly, what the researchers found was that compared to the control group, none of the interventions produced significant improvement in the accuracy of the surrogate's judgment in any illness scenario for any medical treatment. When spouses or children of elderly patients made surrogate decisions about medical treatment based only on their familiarity with the patients, their judgments were just as accurate as that of spouses and children who had read and discussed a detailed living will drawn up by the patient. In addition to these concerns, there are problems with holding a now incompetent patient to past choices to decline life-sustaining measures made when young and in the peak of health. The current patient can no longer revise these choices, even if he derives value from life in this diminished state. The difficulty is illustrated by the hypothetical case of Margot, derived from Andrew Furlick's account of an Alzheimer's patient suffering from dementia who was quite content with her life of visiting with friends whose names she could never recall, drawing the same picture and listening to the same songs. Ronald Dworkin suggested that if Margot had previously executed a living will, categorically refusing life-sustaining measures in the event of dementia, should she now contract pneumonia, she should be denied life-sustaining antibiotics. He argued that to provide antibiotics in this scenario would be to engage in an unacceptable form of moral paternalism and a violation of the patient's desire to shape the conclusion of her life's narrative in a manner consistent with her self-understanding. Rebecca Dresser of Washington University in St. Louis, however, pierces this fiction, the fiction that this is a valid exercise of self-determination for the patient that Margot is now. Rebecca Dresser says, a policy of absolute adherence to advanced directives mean that we deny people like Margot the freedom we enjoy as competent people to change our decisions that conflict with our subsequent experiential interests. Now, while it's not clear what would happen in a real case involving a patient like Margot, the law's preferred approach as a general matter is to bind now incompetent patients to choices previously expressed either formally through a living will or informally through oral statements and behaviors deemed sufficient to indicate past preferences. But by doing so, the law ignores the embodied reality of the profound vulnerability and dependence of the person suffering under the yoke of debilitating cognitive impairment, and instead projects onto him a false image of an intact mind and will. At a time when a person is most fragile and dependent upon the care of others for basic needs, the law elevates freedom and self-determination as its animating goods. In a moment when the patient cannot speak for himself, the law insists that his voice be heard and heeded. The single-minded focus on autonomy, grounded in the anthropology of expressive individualism, thus renders the law unable to respond fully to the unique needs of this stage of life. What is needed, therefore, is a legal approach rooted in an anthropology of embodiment. Such an approach understands that because persons are bodies, the living patient diminished by injury, illness, or senescence is the same person who, when younger and healthier, expressed views about the appropriate use of life-sustaining measures. To honor this person, those views should be honored, but so too should the needs of the patient that he has now become. An anthropology of embodiment would reject here, as it did in the context of the beginning of life, the distinction that some draw between living human beings and human persons based on cognitive capacity. The patient whose cognition has been irretrievably lost does not likewise lose her personhood. The life cycle of the person, even in the very best circumstances, is marked by radical dependence at the beginning of life, development of one's bodily powers, as well as cognition and will, followed by a decline into dependence and vulnerability once again. An anthropology of embodiment recognizes this scale of disability as the nature of life humanly lived, the pathway of all persons. Caring rightly for an incompetent person depending on life-sustaining measures requires thinking carefully about previously expressed preferences, but it does not end there. It requires a prudential weighing of the present needs and circumstances in all of their complexity. And this should occur, as in all cases of profound human dependence throughout life cycle, in networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. This, as elsewhere, requires the practices of the virtues of just generosity, hospitality, and especially accompaniment of others in suffering, also known as misericordia. The focus of care must be the patient who presents herself in all her neediness and vulnerability. Care should not be given according to some idealized standard of how we remember her in the past or how we might wish her to be. Our care is determined by the patient as she is now. What then might a public bioethics of life-sustaining measures look like when augmented by the anthropology of embodiment? Here, as in previous lectures, there are only general principles on offer, with the working out of details deferred for the future. But the first principle is that the law should respond to the unique vulnerability and dependence of this context by strengthening and supporting the networks of giving and receiving necessary to care for such patients. Following the recommendation of the President's Council on Bioethics, the law should encourage the creation of proxy directives, naming those who can make decisions in the event of future circumstances of incompetency. The proxy should carefully consider the preferences expressed by the patient in the past, but also take into account the complexity of present circumstances and the needs of the patient as he currently is. This approach integrates both the good of self-mastery that reflects the freedom and particularity of individuals, as well as the acknowledgement of dependence that is part of every embodied being's story. In the words of the President's Council, the proxy directive does not ignore the significance of our desire to participate in advance in shaping treatment decisions made for us at a time in the future when we can no longer participate concurrently. Precisely by naming someone to serve as our proxy, we take that desire seriously. At the same time, however, this approach emphasizes less the importance of self-determination and correspondingly more the importance of solidarity and interdependence. It invites us to move toward our final days and years, not in a spirit that isolates our free decisions from the networks of those who love and care for us, instead in a spirit that entrusts our dying to those who have supported us in our living. It enlists them to stay by our side to the very end. The proxy must resist the temptation to project his own judgment about quality of life, viewed from his perch as an able-bodied and healthy individual. There's a natural temptation to look at those in a diminished state and conclude that theirs is a life not worth living. But if we are demonstrably bad at predicting how we ourselves might derive meaning and joy in a state of disability, we're even worse at judging how others might do so. The temptation to alleviate suffering or disability by eliminating the patient must be resisted. The President's Council offers a useful framework for avoiding this well-meaning and paternalistic, but ultimately misguided judgment about a life not worth living. The proxy decision maker should focus on the medical intervention under consideration. Declining treatment because itself is unduly burdensome or futile is different from than doing so for purposes of hastening the end of a life judged by the proxy to be of low quality. Refusing or terminating an unduly burdensome or futile treatment on behalf of an incompetent patient is a choice for a different, perhaps shorter life. It is not a choice for death. Proxies are less likely to project their own preferences onto the patient in their charge if they remain focused on the intervention, the medical intervention at issue, not on the underlying condition. Of course, fleshing out the meaning of burden and futility requires a great deal of fact-bound thought and reflection that is better left to a future inquiry. For those without family or friends, the law must step into the breach and fill the gap in the network of giving and receiving on which the vulnerable depend. As the Council advises, we should not too readily acquiesce in a vision that isolates us in the time of our dependency, or a vision that rests on the false notion that individuals can precisely determine and manage every fact of their lives until the very end. The law should, as here, as elsewhere rather, work to shore up the networks of giving and receiving throughout society such that the goods of friendship and solidarity will be practiced and well developed, thus ready to respond to the most pressing crises of care. The law of assisted suicide, on the other hand, is legally different, ethically different, and normatively different. The law of assisted suicide is easy to state. It is up to the states themselves, the individual states in our country, to determine their own policies and laws. Oregon was the first state to legalize assisted suicide, and its law has served as a paradigm for all others that have followed suit, almost with very slight modifications. Those jurisdictions that have legalized assisted suicide since Oregon did have almost created an identical statutory framework. The Oregon law authorizes terminally ill adult Oregon residents to obtain a prescription for a lethal dose of drugs, which they may self-administer for purposes of ending their lives. The law forbids euthanasia, namely the direct killing of one person by another. It requires the self-administration of the lethal agent to take one's own life. Death by means of assisted suicide is not defined as suicide under Oregon law, and death certificates list only the underlying terminal illness as the cause of death. Terminal illness is defined as a malady that will produce death in 6 months or less, but the law does not specify whether this prognosis distinguishes life expectancy with treatment versus without it. Competency under the law is defined as the ability to make and communicate healthcare decisions. To obtain a prescription, eligible patients are required to make 2 oral requests of a physician. It need not be the same physician, separated by at least 15 days. Recently, the state enacted a waiver provision for cases where the doctor believes the patient might die during the waiting period. He or she must also issue a written request signed by 2 witnesses, though there are no restrictions on who these witnesses might be. 2 physicians, 1 prescribing and 1 consulting, must confirm the diagnosis, prognosis, and capability of the patient to make the request. If either physician believes that the patient's judgment is impaired by a psychiatric or psychological disorder, he is permitted to refer him for evaluation. There is no mandatory psychiatric or psychological assessment of patients seeking prescriptions. The prescribing physician must advise the patient of alternatives, including comfort care, hospice care, and pain control. There is no requirement that the prescribing physician have expertise in any of these fields, however. The physician may request, though may not require, that the patient advise family or next of kin of the request for the prescription. Such physicians are nearly always members or affiliates of Compassion and Choices, which is the principal advocacy organization for assisted suicide in America. There is a limited number of doctors in the state of Oregon willing to prescribe lethal medications. Once the prescription is issued, there is no requirement that any physician be present for the administration of the lethal dose. Physicians are immunized from suit if they are found to have made a, quote, good faith effort to comply with the law, a significantly more permissive standard than the usual framework for malpractice. Since 1998, 1,500 people or so have taken their own lives under the Death with Dignity Act. The number of patients ending their lives under the law has steadily increased, doubling from the 4-year period of 2008 to 2012 to 2013 to 2017. Data is provided to the Oregon Health Authority by the physicians. The state does not have the funding or a mechanism to validate or audit the reports that it receives. Original reports are destroyed once the state reports its aggregated data. As before, the inductive analysis of the law focuses first on the goods it seeks to advance, and then the underlying assumptions of human identity and flourishing on which the goods are premised. The twin goods invoked to support laws, such as Oregon's Death with Dignity Act, are autonomy and compassion. These aspirations are linked in the very name of the nation's leading assisted suicide advocacy organization, Compassion and Choices. The law is meant to allow the exercise of self-determination in the face of a terminal illness to choose the time and manner of one's demise. An array of famous American moral and political philosophers, Ronald Dworkin, John Rawls, Thomas Nagel, Thomas Scanlon, and Judith Jarvis Thompson, of the famous violinist analogy that we discussed during the abortion conversation that we had several weeks ago. They all filed an amicus brief to the Supreme Court in its consideration of a case called Washington v. Glucksberg and a companion case called Vacco v. Quill, questioning whether or not there's a constitutional right to assisted suicide, a fundamental unenumerated right. The court held in a 9-0 decision that there was no such right under the Constitution. But nevertheless, the philosopher's brief, as it was called, was published in the New York Review of Books with great fanfare. It invoked the precedent of Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the principal abortion precedent in American jurisprudence, for a broad individual right of self-determination in making the most intimate and personal choices. The choice of how and when to die, the brief argued, was a pristine example of such a self-defining decision. Quote, "Most of us see death, whatever we think will follow it, as the final act of one's life's drama. We want that last act to reflect our own convictions, those we have tried to live by, not the convictions of others forced on us in our most vulnerable moment." 17 years later, the face of the campaign for assisted suicide, after a round defeat in the Supreme Court, the face of the campaign for assisted suicide became Brittany Maynard, a beautiful and dynamic young woman in her 20s who moved to Oregon to take her own life following a diagnosis of terminal brain cancer. She spoke passionately about the freedom to choose the timing and manner of her death to avoid the pain and decline of her disease. She situated this choice in the larger context of the freedom to pursue the life of one's dreams. Quote, "The reason to consider life and what's of value to you is to make sure you're not missing out. Seize the day. What's important to you? What do you care about? What matters? Pursue that and forget the rest." That's one quote from Brittany Maynard. Now, the executives of Compassion Choices were elated for such an appealing spokeswoman for the right to assisted suicide. They created ad campaigns and websites, including such slogans as "My life, my death, my choice." "I support Brittany Maynard and all Americans' rights to choose." #Death with Dignity. This campaign was influential in the successful path to push legalized assisted suicide in California, which was Maynard's home state. Alongside the freedom to exercise autonomy in shaping the timing and manner of one's death, advocates cite compassion for the suffering as the second core animating good of assisted suicide legalization. They invoke compelling images of patients suffering from excruciating and refractory pain, which only ends in death. Assisted suicide is thus justified as a compassionate option for those with intolerable suffering to end the pain by ending their lives with the assistance of a physician. These are compelling arguments vividly argued. To one who is anticipating a life of decline, pain, and death, the image of the solitary individual imposing the rational mastery of his will on these dire circumstances, at once exercising his fundamental freedom, using it to author the ending to his life story with the integrity and coherence of his self-understanding, and in so doing, avoiding an undignified and painful decline, might be appealing. It's an image of freedom, choice, and dignity that resonates deeply with rugged American individualism as well as romantic expressivism. But it's a vision that is deeply forgetful of the body and the profound vulnerability and dependence faced not only by patients who choose assisted suicide, but also the vulnerable populations who live in those jurisdictions that have embraced the law, ethics, and culture of assisted suicide. The anthropology of expressive individualism fails to account for the diminished agency at the margins of life for an embodied being in time, and thus overstates the possibility of autonomy in this setting and underestimates the risks of systemic neglect, fraud, abuse, mistake, and coercion in a legal regime that allows assisted suicide. Accordingly, the law in Oregon, on which all other similar state laws are modeled, fails to adopt crucial safeguards to protect the fragile, the needy, the elderly, the poor, the stigmatized, and the disabled for such threats. Indeed, just as in the previous context discussed, such vulnerable persons are absent from expressive individualism's field of vision. Moreover, the data from Oregon, sparse though it is, calls into question whether assisted suicide is a panacea for patients with intractable and excruciating pain. First, the law in Oregon does not take into account the strong correlation between mental illness, especially treatable depression, and suicidal ideation and desires. There's a large body of social science evidence that shows a supermajority of persons with suicidal ideation suffer from mental illness, including a clear majority suffering from treatable depression. A review of the medical literature showed that, quote, the incidence of suicide in someone with a cancer diagnosis is approximately double the incidence of suicide in the general population. For cancer patients, depression was the major risk factor for suicidality, and such patients were 4 times more likely to have a desire for hastened death compared with those patients without depression, 47% of cancer patients with depression versus 12%. The National Cancer Institute also found a strong correlation between cancer patients suffering from depression and the false sense that they were a burden to their loved ones. Moreover, another study on suicidal ideation in the elderly noted that a universal finding is the strong association with psychiatric illness, particularly depression. It concluded that, quote, the fact that there is a high prevalence of potentially treatable psychiatric illnesses in those elderly people who have both physical illness and suicidal ideation should be central in any discussion of physician-assisted suicide. These studies are highly relevant to assessing whether patients in Oregon are capable of the sort of autonomy that the law assumes. 76% of patients who have died by assisted suicide in the state suffered from cancer, and the median age of all the patients was 72. Yet there is no mandatory rigorous screening for psychiatric illness that might compromise the self-determination of those who request prescriptions to end their lives. Consulting or prescribing physicians are required to order such evaluations only when they feel the psychiatric condition might, quote, impair the judgment of the patient. The brute numbers confirm without doubt that physicians administering Oregon's Death with Dignity Act do not regard depression as ever impairing judgment. To wit, in 2018, less than 2% of patients were referred for psychiatric or psychological evaluation, despite the fact that the incidence of depression among cancer patients in the elderly expressing suicidal desires are orders of magnitude higher. And there is no information regarding what happened following such consultations. The data is not gathered or reported. It is possible that the small number of physicians in Oregon who participate in the Death with Dignity Act are not able to recognize depression in their encounters with patients. Only 28% of Oregon physicians surveyed indicated that they felt confident to identify clinical depression in a patient. In any event, all indications are that patients suffering from treatable depression, a major but reversible factor in the formation of suicidal desires, are regularly being prescribed lethal drugs. This raises serious questions about the reality of autonomy of the patients assumed under the law. Most worrisome of all is that there is no requirement to assess voluntariness or competence at the time the patient ingests the lethal drugs. The median length of time between first request and death is 47 days. Indeed, there is no obligation at all for a physician to attend the self-administration of the drugs. Unsurprisingly, since 1998, the prescribing physician was confirmed to be present at the time of death in only 15% of cases. As a result, Oregon has very little information on complications that arise from drug during self-administration. In 53% of cases since 1998, this information is coded as unknown. Thus, there is simply no rigorous, systematic, and verifiable way to know anything about the state of mind of the vast supermajority of Oregon patients when they self-administered lethal drugs to take their own lives. There's additional evidence that patients in Oregon are not choosing to die free from internal pressures. In 2018, 54% of the patients who obtained prescriptions reported that they were seeking to end their lives because they perceive themselves as a burden to family and friends, the highest percentage recorded since 1998. 67% of patients received insurance from government sources, Medicare or Medicaid. The percentage of patients on government insurance doubled from 2008 2012 to 2013 to 2017. These programs fully cover aid in dying, but have payment caps and on other possible life-extending interventions. The argument that assisted suicide is necessary and humane response to the intractable suffering of the terminally ill patients is also belied by the evidence, scant though it is. For one thing, unlike in Europe, intolerable suffering is not a prerequisite for eligibility for assisted suicide. The threshold condition is a diagnosis of terminal illness, which is, of course, a famously difficult prediction to make. Only 26% of respondents in 2018 reported that inadequate pain control or concerns about it motivated them to pursue a lethal prescription. This number has remained relatively stable since 1998. By far the most common rationales for seeking assisted suicide were concerns about, quote, losing autonomy and being, quote, less able to engage in activities making life enjoyable. For those terminally ill patients who are in intractable pain, there is no requirement that the consulting or prescribing physicians who administer the Death with Dignity Act have expertise or even minimal qualifications to evaluate pain or propose a plan for pain management. As a result, they are severely compromised in their ability to identify and clearly explain to patients the options for pain management or palliative care that could offer an alternative to assisted suicide. In this way, the law does not enable the autonomy of patients, nor does it respond fully to their suffering. And there's evidence showing that some jurisdictions that have legalized assisted suicide make less use of hospice care as a general matter. Oregon made major strides in developing hospice programs prior to legalizing assisted suicide, but since legalizing this, the practice, its hospice utilization has fallen below the national average. Washington and Vermont, states that have also legalized assisted suicide, likewise fall below the national average in hospice utilization. Concerns about diminished autonomy and lack of meaningful safeguards against neglect, fraud, abuse, duress, and mistake are amplified for vulnerable populations, such as the disabled, the elderly, the marginalized, and the poor. In 1994, the New York Task Force on Life and Law, an advisory body to Governor Mario Cuomo, put the problem this way. Quote, we believe that the practices of assisted suicide and euthanasia would be profoundly dangerous for large segments of the population, especially in light of the widespread failure of American medicine to treat pain adequately or to diagnose and treat depression in many cases. The risks would extend to all individuals who are ill, but they would be most severe for those whose autonomy and well-being are already compromised by poverty, lack of access to good medical care, or membership in a stigmatized social group. The risks of legalizing assisted suicide and euthanasia for these individuals in a healthcare system and society that cannot effectively protect against the impact of inadequate resources and ingrained social disadvantage are likely to be extraordinary. These worries have been acknowledged by the Supreme Court in the United States in the mid-1990s, as well as by courts of last resort in New Mexico and New York in 2016 and 2017, despite claims that such worries had proven to be unfounded. There is simply no rigorous, verifiable system of data collection to gather sufficient information to rule out these concerns. Moreover, the absence of any requirement in the law of Oregon and those states modeled upon it that there be rigorous and mandatory evaluation for relevant psychiatric or psychological conditions, the voluntariness and competency be assessed at the time the lethal drugs are ingested, that there be consultation with the next of kin, or that anyone be present at the time of the ingestion and death, opens the door to all manner of fraud, abuse, duress, coercion, mistake, or even homicide. In short, the Oregon law's failure to take seriously the dependence, fragility, and diminished agency of embodied beings in the grip of terminal illness poses potentially grave risks for a wide circle of vulnerable people. The logic of autonomy and compassion that animates Oregon laws does not contain limiting principles sufficient to restrict the law to the regime of assisted suicide only for the terminally ill. Instead, the full and coherent embrace of the norms point to the acceptance of direct killing by euthanasia for any reason, including in the absence of a request. It does not fully respect the autonomy of a patient, nor is it compassionate to deny him access to aid in dying because of his reasons for seeking it. For example, maybe he's not terminally ill. It is not compassionate, nor does it honor his freedom to allow only oral self-administration of lethal drugs as a means to end life. Some patients aren't capable of taking drugs orally. Similarly, it's not compassionate to deny aid in dying to those patients, including children and the cognitively disabled, who are not able to make the request on their own behalf. Thus, in countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, the practice has moved inexorably from assisted suicide to euthanasia, from voluntary to non-voluntary, allowing, for example, the direct killing of infants under the Groningen Protocol. in the Netherlands. Moreover, the reasons for euthanasia have expanded rapidly to encompass autism, depression, and even because one life seems meaningless. There are already proposals to liberalize the Oregon law further, to relax the definition of terminal illness, to embrace a very wide array of conditions, to expand the definition of self-administer to include other delivery systems besides oral ingestion, and to allow healthcare providers aside from physicians to make such prescriptions. Vulnerable communities have expressed deep concern about these risks imposed by legalizing assisted suicide. Organizations that advocate for the rights of the disabled have been especially resistant to legalizing assisted suicide on the grounds that it promotes a social attitude that lives characterized by diminished physical or cognitive functioning are worse than death. Such advocates worry about assisted suicide laws enhancing already entrenched attitudes of bigotry and discriminatory practices toward the disabled. But even more frightening is the prospect of disabled persons being pressured subtly or overtly to end their own lives. Relatedly, many physicians and the American Medical Association itself have opposed legalization of assisted suicide on the grounds that it would transform medicine from a healing art to its opposite and sow doubt and mistrust between doctors and patients. The AMA cautioned against temptations that might pose to doctors. Quote, "Death offers a dangerous sense of mastery for the healthcare professional who is frustrated at not finding a cure." Columbia University psychiatrist Paul Applebaum has expressed the worry that assisted suicide will remove incentives to treat difficult cases. He asks, will psychiatrists conclude from the legalization of assisted death that it is acceptable to give up on treating some patients? Conversely, he's concerned with the advent of assisted suicide might risk inducing hopelessness among individuals with similar conditions and removing pressure for an improvement in psychiatric and social services. Drawing implicitly upon the anthropology of expressive individualism, the law of assisted suicide offers freedom of the atomized individual disembodied will in response to the vulnerability, dependence, fragility, and natural limits of embodied life as it nears its end. What it offers concretely is the freedom to choose self-annihilation as a mechanism to control the conclusion of life's narrative. But because the law fails to grasp the diminished agency of a human being whose body is dying, the framework it offers is rife with risks of fraud, abuse, duress, neglect, and coercion, especially for those populations who are already vulnerable because of old age, disability, poverty, or membership in a stigmatized group. The answer to this failure is not to seek additional processes and procedures that will allow for the autonomy of the solitary individual to annihilate himself, but rather to strengthen and support the networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving that cared for him when he was radically dependent as he entered the world and will do so again as he leaves it. The role of the law is to encourage and reward the practices of just generosity, hospitality, and accompaniment of others in suffering. It should support the opportunities for people to learn and practice gratitude, humility, openness to the unbidden, and tolerance of imperfection. The law should support the cultivation of the moral imagination to see our neighbor in the suffering other, and for those who see their own intrinsic and equal dignity despite suffering from a diminished and dependent condition. More concretely, the law must allow for the aggressive palliation of pain, and it must protect vulnerable populations by not creating legal regimes that teach that their lives are not worth living and in which they might even be pressured or coerced into ending them. As with the prior lectures on these subjects, how the law might accomplish these ends is a highly complex question for a future inquiry, but it is again useful to articulate the broad aims of public bioethics and end-of-life care that is augmented by an anthropology of embodiment. And one concrete thing that we can, or that I'm confident of at least, is that the law should not make legal the facilitation of suicide, transforming the role of doctor as healer to something like the handmaiden of death. So thank you all for your patience, and I look forward to your questions and conversation.
Thanks, Carter. Really appreciate your comments here. And if it's okay, we're going to transition to our Q&A, and happy to take your questions, again, using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We have a few questions. Carter, are you ready to get started?
Yep, let's do it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask some questions. And again, like y'all were really shy in the past where the questions are slow to come in, and then all of a sudden we have all these questions and we can't get to them. So please send us your questions. But we'll start with a question from Stephen O'Neill, who said, Carter, Would you mind commenting on what's happening in Canada with medical aid in dying? They're much further down the PAS euthanasia path. Do you see the slippery slope that they are on eventually coming here to the US? And what can be done to slow the spread or the use of PAS/euthanasia?
Yeah, so my sense of the Canadian situation is they are further along. I think culturally they're more approving of what they call medical aid in dying, which we refer to as assisted suicide, although the terminological debate, obviously, and the rhetoric varies depending on the perspective of the person who's making the argument. The thing that distinguishes the US, though, and the thing that I'm grateful for in the United States, is that the American Medical Association what the pattern that I noticed in Europe and in Canada and in those jurisdictions like California, which legalizes assisted suicide, or the states in which assisted suicide is legalized, versus those like voices, including Ted Kennedy's widow and Ezekiel Emanuel, who was one of the architects and advisors of the Affordable Care Act, President Obama. They opposed assisted suicide on the grounds that it transformed the practice of medicine and made vulnerable groups who are already vulnerable because of poverty, age, membership in a discrete and stigmatized minority, or people with disabilities. And as long as the American Medical Association, the local medical associations stand firm, I think we've been able to resist the wave that has taken place in other countries. Now, there are states that have legalized assisted suicide, quite a few, Colorado and Vermont and others, although roughly within the same time period, there have been about the same number of states that have explicitly forbidden assisted suicide in their laws. So it's not all one direction. But in California, right before they legalized assisted suicide, the California Medical Association declared neutrality on the matter, and then the politics became unstoppable. And that's been true in other jurisdictions, and that's been true in Canada. It's been true. So the doctors, and this is important for your audience, the physicians' voices against assisted suicide, I think, are the most important voices that we have. That, and perhaps the disability rights community, those people suffering from disabilities as well. And for that matter, actually in California, it was almost, there was a very strong push from the African-American community in California, who were extremely skeptical about a regime in which assisted suicide would be lawful. They had deep concerns about how that would be administered and how the kind of discrimination that community suffers under normal circumstances would be amplified, and the dangers that they would be subjected to once assisted suicide was on the table motivated them to strongly oppose the legalization of assisted suicide. So in answer to Stephen's question, I think that we've been able to hold the line to the extent that we have in the United States because of the voices of doctors and medical and professional societies, and also other very compelling figures who have a keen understanding of what happens when the laws change to make them more vulnerable, namely disability rights communities and others.
Thanks, Carter. Just one comment that I wanted to share. Dan says, thank you for this particular subject and presentation. This is relevant to my daily work as a hospital chaplain, and the work of the medical teams I serve with. The reading and presentation will help me in critical conversations. I just wanted to share that with you.
Nice.
So we have a complicated question from Andrew Old, so I'll read this slowly. Thank you, Professor Snead. I'm interested in your views on the difference between traditional advance directives and advanced care planning, ACP, as it relates to the risk of inappropriate reliance on expressive individualism. Does ACP, or advanced care planning, as a counseled process, that at its best, it's a family process, taking account of future incompetence, go some way to address the concerns you outline? If not, what practical tools exist for physicians to support patients with life-defining illnesses to best support their autonomy at the end of life?
Yeah, so I would need to know more about that model of shared decision making to have a sharp opinion about it. But let me just say generally, any kind of process that facilitates collaborative discussion among the people who love and are committed to caring for the person who is facing an end of life decision is to the good. What we want to avoid, and this is sort of my fundamental point, we want to avoid legal instruments and documents or mechanisms that take the false premise that what a person needs is to maximize their self-determination and to somehow create the illusion of governing one's treatment beyond one's capacity to actually participate in one's own decision making. That to me is the single most problematic dimension of this single-minded focus on living wills as the principal mechanism of controlling care once one has lost competency. I think, and which is not to say that they're not useful. It's just to say that as a panacea, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's rooted in a false understanding of who the patient is and what the patient needs. And then that's, again, supported, I think, by a lot of social science evidence as well.
Thanks. And I have a question here also from Gregory Roper. My question at the end of all this is, for those of us who are persuaded by your analysis of the harms of expressive individualism, how do we begin to change such a deeply embedded societal and cultural understanding of anthropology? Is there any hope beyond, say, religious communities of winning this philosophical, political, legal, and cultural battle? If we cannot, is the only chance to have legal decisions, eventually by the Supreme Court, hold the line here? Isn't this your point, that without changing the views of anthropology, the depredations of expressive individualism will continue to rule legal and political life in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I am optimistic about it. Taking the examples of the topics that we've covered over the course of these lectures, the only way to change the concept, the grounding of expressive individualism as the principal animating vision for the law of abortion is to allow people to govern themselves on the issue of abortion, to allow the deliberative process to take place where people can make the case to one another, to invite them to draw upon their own lived experience and to realize and help cultivate their own moral imagination, to realize that this vision is a false vision. It's an incomplete vision, that you actually have to think about the ways in which we're deeply connected to one another and interdependent upon one another. But as long as the Supreme Court holds to itself the authority to make decisions about abortion, as it has done since Roe and Casey, it's going to be very, very difficult to do that. And I don't think the way to change it is to try to make arguments, anthropological arguments, vis-a-vis constitutional interpretation, to say that, oh, the Constitution, in fact, supports an anthropology of embodiment, so we should interpret it that way and therefore have a different kind of policy on abortion. I think it's very simple. What has to happen in the context of abortion, the Supreme Court has to give the question back to the political branches, and that requires them to overturn Roe and Casey. And we can reason together and bear witness to one another, and also kind of express in our interpersonal relationships those virtues and manifest those virtues of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving, and love each other unconditionally. And that's really what changes people's minds. What changes people's minds is not well-constructed discursive argumentation. I mean, that's important. You have to have, that's an essential piece of the process. But really, people who believe in the anthropology of embodiment, who believe that we're connected to each other, that we belong to each other, and that we owe, and we stand in a certain kind of obligation to each other, have to act like it. And I'm not criticizing him. I'm saying it's really, I'm talking to myself more than anybody else. We have to act like it when we interact with our friends and neighbors, especially those who don't agree with us. So insofar as we're capable of governing ourselves, it seems to me that is, we can actually, and so you take the second example of assisted reproductive technology, that's an area in which we're actually, the law permits us to deliberate and have conversations and to craft both laws and policies and cultural norms and expressions that reflect the deeper truth about who we are and what we owe to each other. And I am optimistic about it. So I don't think that, and in the context of end-of-life decision-making, we find ourselves in the same place. We can express, and so, I mean, I think about what's a concrete example of this. I mean, I think supporting the work of the Little Sisters of the Poor, for example, is like a small concrete proposal as to how we can change hearts and minds and at the same time extend genuine care to other people. These are religious sisters who have dedicated their lives to caring for the elderly poor, especially in their dying. And that to me is in some ways supporting and highlighting and underscoring the work of communities like that can change hearts and minds. That's a thing that can kind of soften people's intransigence and sticking to their own arguments, to their own, I think, false ideas about autonomy. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah, we had, we're running the medical school running an elective right now on health, spirituality, and religion, and non-clinical elective for our branch medical students. And we're having conversations about some of these topics in the elective. And we were talking about, specifically ageism and ableism in medicine recently, especially during the pandemic and such. And the students rightly were talking about how oftentimes the folks that they see in the hospital that they're making decisions about, disabled people, elderly people, they said, we don't see these folks like in our communities, like we don't see them at the store. We don't see them at our like reading group. We don't see them at the gym. We don't see them at like, in our homes, right? Because we've been talking about oftentimes folks who are on the margins of society being in this throwaway culture, and that the antidote for that is this culture of encounter. And it's interesting when I've talked to residents about this topic, oftentimes my residents who are most passionate about this topic are people who grew up with a disabled sister, disabled brother, disabled mother. I'm still thinking about, just as you talked about, these embedded communities and how we live every day, to be able to think about folks and have our hearts changed in the midst of encounter. Another question too, just because it's come up a couple of times, is around language. So I have a particular interest in narrative medicine, and we know that language can shape our cultural narrative around things like abortion and end of life. And you've used different terms today, like physician-assisted suicide and medical aid in dying and death with dignity. And oftentimes there's appropriate sort of concern over how language is used in these different spaces. And many people say you shouldn't call it suicide because there's stigma associated with that term, and it should be made and that kind of thing. How do you make sense of the language game specifically with end of life?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and it goes even beyond that to legal documentation. They will list the cause of death being the underlying illness rather than, which creates a serious, just like the problem of like fact finding and data collection becomes much more difficult when the death certificate doesn't in fact list that a person died from an overdose of barbiturates rather than cancer or whatever. It's so I can understand the motivation of people who want to destigmatize different practices, but there's a line, it seems to me, between destigmatization, or describing something in a way that is more captures the sort of plurality of views on a question versus a kind of tendentious hiding of the moral problem. And we talked a lot about this on the President's Council on Bioethics. And one of the best things that the President's Council ever published was in its Human Cloning and Human Dignity book. I think it's chapter 3. It's on terminology, and it's on the importance of calling things by their right names and how that importance generally, but that kind of norm of truthfulness becomes even more important when we're trying to reason together in a pluralistic community about the goods and harms that are at stake, ethical harms, real, physical harms, and harms of coercion and duress and fraud and abuse and discrimination and so on. Like to describe in a way that captures the reality of the moral, what is morally at stake, the human goods at stake. So it feels to me like, so here's an example. The International Society for Stem Cell Research years and years ago wanted to stop using the word embryo because they thought the word embryo was too emotionally charged. They would rather, to its great credit, the peer-reviewed scientific journal Nature, probably arguably the most prestigious journal in the world for peer-reviewed scientific articles, took them to task and said, you can't win this debate by hiding the ball, by hiding the moral dispute. You can't stop using the word embryo. The word embryo is controversial because the subject matter is controversial. And it seems to me the same is true in terms of the end of life decision making, right? So what I really am trying not. I try hard not to be inflammatory or tendentious or manipulative in my use of language. And I try to be sensitive to people who don't agree, but I really do have a hard time describing the action of deliberately self-administering a lethal agent for the sake of ending your own life as anything other than suicide. I don't understand how, and to say aid in dying, that doesn't, especially by the way, when it's not limited to the terminally ill, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to me to say that we're going to allow the dying process to continue or to move forward by withdrawing basic ordinary care from a patient that we know is efficacious and not unduly burdensome, right? So that's to say we're going to allow this person to die when in fact what we're doing is aiming at their death and trying to hasten their death. And it's really important, by the way, to be very precise in language in terms of the context of deciding to discontinue or to terminate or to not initiate life-sustaining measures. And because what you're doing and why you're doing it has deep ethical and public policy significance to it, right? If I decide, I mean, you think of it, this is kind of obvious, silly example, but like if I say, I'm going to discontinue, I'm not going to continue artificial nutrition for a person because they can't metabolize it anymore. It's not providing them with any nutrition. All it's doing is serving as a kind of culture medium for infection. And I've deemed, it has been deemed by experts not to be efficacious anymore in its proximate end of providing nutrition and sustaining the life of this person. That's one. So my goal is to discontinue something because it's not working, or I want to discontinue, a certain very painful intervention because the patient finds it unduly burdensome. They don't want to die, but they don't want this intervention because this intervention is too much, or it takes them away from being fully present to their family. That's discontinuing an intervention that is unduly burdensome, as opposed to discontinuing a life-sustaining measure because I want someone to be dead, because I want their inheritance, to take a crass example, or because I've decided that it's time for them to die. They've lived long enough, and this current condition they're in is not their underlying condition, not the medical interventions, are undignified, and it's not a life not worth living, and I want to hasten their death. Those are ethically very different choices. All of them are very different. Now, they are in the end-of-life decision-making context for reasons that I think make sense. We don't scrutinize the reasoning why people discontinue life-sustaining measures in most instances, especially when you're dealing with a legally competent person who can make their own choices. We're not sending the district attorney in to interrogate them as to why it is they're declining further dialysis or further chemotherapy. And I think there are probably good reasons for that when you're dealing with a person of sound mind. But if you're talking about an incompetent patient, a person who cannot make decisions, about whom there's no evidence of what their intentions are, we are a little bit more scrupulous about why it is we're doing what we're doing and what the consequences are. And in the context of assisted suicide, it's even more significant because you're dealing with someone who is profoundly vulnerable due to probably treatable depression, maybe badly managed pain, maybe because they feel like they're a burden to their family members, maybe because they're afraid, who knows why. But that is not a person at the height of their flourishing, and to say to give them the capacity to self-administer a lethal drug for the sake of ending their own life. I mean, if your goal is to stop living, if that's and you can measure that, and Charlie Camosy talks about this all the time, we can test what your intentions were by imagining the counterfactual or what you do doesn't work. When you turn off the respirator for the patient because you think that it's not working, or because you think that it's unduly burdensome, and they continue to breathe on your own, you're not disappointed, right? Whereas if I give someone a prescription of barbiturates to kill themselves and they take it and they don't die, that's a failure, right? And so the point is to end your own life. It's not to let the natural process to continue its course. It is to actively intervene for the purpose of ending your own life. And if that's not suicide, I don't know what is.
Thanks, Carter. So Andrew Old also made a comment for anyone interested in another example of state-sanctioned euthanasia in New Zealand. He said, has just enacted assisted dying legislation in November of 2021. So I think it is important for us to know not only what's going on in the United States, but elsewhere as well. Thanks, Andrew. Another question. The language game is a legal tool. For example, here in Massachusetts, palliative care laws say that nothing in them is to be construed as assisted suicide, but the assisted suicide bill says the act is not to be called assisted suicide. So it gets pro-life people on board with these palliative care laws actually designed to work with medical aid in dying when it is legalized. That is why you cannot make sense of the refusal to use the word suicide. So again, just a comment about the power of language. I also want to make a comment. There was a question from an anonymous attendee about are the lectures recorded and accessible? Yes, all of the lectures. Carter has been so kind to allow us to record all the lectures, and they are available on the Burr Oak website for anyone that's interested. We have time for one more question here. Sort of as you mentioned, there are payment caps, you said, around end of life and sort of having people assisted in chronic illness, where there is obviously concern about the financial implications of this regarding it's much less expensive to give someone something to have them die than to support people in the way they should be supported in chronic illness. And some of us are worried that some of these slippery slopes may lead to not just a choice to die, but a duty to die based on financial sort of realities. Some people have called that sort of duty to die sort of forecast sort of hyperbole, or you're an alarmist. Do you think the duty to die concern is one of true concern?
Well, I mean, there are examples of insurance companies sending letters to patients saying we will not pay for this experimental cancer therapy or palliative chemotherapy, but we will pay for aid in dying. We'll pay for assisted suicide. We'll pay for the drugs the barbiturates to take your own life. That's not a hypothetical. That's a real thing that happened. But one need not even cite concrete examples of formal communications that lead a person to conclude that they have a duty to die. And it's a perfectly human response to not want to be a burden to your family, to not want to be a burden to the community. And the fact that so many folks who seek assisted suicide in these jurisdictions are on government-sponsored kinds of insurance indicate the possibility for worrisome influences, subtle or more overt, on the part of the payer for these treatments to try to signal to people what they should do. There was a couple of years ago, there was, I forget, it might have been the Veterans Association had a questionnaire that they published in there for the people and the patients in the VA. And the questions were so tendentious. Basically, the questions were like, do you really want to keep living in light of all these other things? Don't you think, I'm paraphrasing, but like they were worded in a way that left one with the impression that the right answer to the questionnaire was to indicate that, in fact, I am a burden and maybe I should think about declining life-sustaining measures, even if I'm not otherwise dying. Then elderly people basically have have a duty not to consume resources for others. We know how many resources are consumed towards the end of life in terms of healthcare. I mean, and look, among the mainstream bioethics literature, it's not a controversial thing to talk about rationing or quality adjusted life years. I mean, Ezekiel Emanuel, who's a very prominent and prestigious figure in the world of bioethics and the world of health policy, wrote an op-ed talking about, that maybe he doesn't want to live past. I mean, I vaguely remember the argument, but it was something to the effect of he didn't want to live past 70. He thought that 70 was probably a pretty good number to consume the resources of the community. That's not unusual. That's a pretty well beaten path of argumentation in the bioethics literature. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to suggest, and especially when you consider, scarcity. The more scarcity there is, there are hard conversations that happen, hard policies that happen around allocation of resources. And in that context, there are pressures, subtle and stronger, generally speaking, but then you inject assisted suicide or perhaps even euthanasia into the conversation, or even end-of-life decision-making, termination of life-sustaining measures. Now you have a quite different complexion to the conversation, it seems to me, that should give pause and does give pause to the communities of those who are poor and disabled and elderly, and, as I say, members of stigmatized groups who see immediately who's going to be first in line to be deprived of resources when we adopt that mindset.
Yeah, and just so we just went over that piece by Zeke Emanuel. It's in the Atlantic from a few years ago. And just to give credit to Zeke Emanuel, he wants to die at 75, not 70, but
that's
close
way
enough.
better. Yeah, sorry.
And in the piece, he talks about the reason that that everyone, not just he, but everyone, that society, he said, is better off when you die at 75 is because you become pathetic, is the word that he uses, because you're not able to contribute to work based on this consumerism model of utility based on being able to produce and consume, and you become disabled, which leaves you pathetic. And it's really, I mean, I find that piece really shocking that a prominent, internist and bioethicist in this country has clearly very ageist and ableist views that he's sharing, and that he makes policies and writes op-eds about how to allocate scarce resources during the pandemic in the New England Journal of Medicine, et cetera. So yes, we have a long way to go to have a correct anthropology in medicine. But so thank you, Carter. Let's have a few comments as we close here. So again, thank you all, friends, for coming to these webinars with us. We've had great discussions about really thick topics, and appreciate Carter's willingness to engage with us on these topics. Just a couple comments about future programming for those of you that are interested. So the Burke Foundation is hosting a get-together of U of M. So if you're at the University of Michigan, if you're a student of any level or a trainee and you love music, we're going to have a small get-together of dinner at my house with a professor of piano at University of Michigan, Professor Dr. Harding, who's full professor of music. He's going to come with my piano, talk about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. We're gonna have dinner, talk with Dr. Harding, and then we're gonna go to the Detroit Symphony Orchestra and have a listening of the performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. If you're interested, the Baroque website has information about how to sign up for that activity. And if you're interested in learning more about either Burr Oak or the University of Michigan Medical School program on health, spirituality, religion, and want to support our work, we're happy to chat with any of you. So please contact me or Joe if you would like to support our work or hear more about the work we're doing at our respective places. And lastly, we have a very short, I promise it's super short, I made it so it's short, Qualtrics survey that I just put into the chat. That will take you to a survey just to answer some questions about the webinar, if it met your needs, et cetera, what we can do better next time, any ideas for future programming. So that's where we'll end. So please link to the survey, and we'll see you hopefully in the near future. Carter, again, thanks so much for your help. Joe, thanks so much for your comments tonight. And thanks for all of you for attending this evening. Good night, friends.
Thanks.
Thanks.